This oral history of museum computing is provided by Jonathan Bowen and was recorded on the 1st of March 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
Okay, well, a lot of people know me in the museum IT world from the virtual library museums pages, but that's been written about quite a lot. I've written a lot of papers on it, whereas what I'm going to talk about today is something I haven't really written about very much because it's pre-web. It's just about internet age, but I guess it was pre I started using the internet mostly. So it was the very early days of computing when microcomputers were starting to take over. Uh, just a bit of history for me. I did engineering at university where we had a sort of very brief course on computing. Most of it was sort of real engineering. So I did do a little bit of Fortran, and at school I'd done a little bit of Algol 60 on things like paper tape. This is the university cards. So so that was, but you notice these still exist. You can actually read these with your eye. So these are very good media for lasting a long time. Whereas then my first job was actually at Marconi Instruments, where I was working on PDP-11s. So we had these nice, this is an 8-inch floppy disk. Well, whether this is readable or not, I don't know. So sometime I want to try reading all these various bits of media to see what's left on it, but that's magnetism that may well have disappeared, whereas the holes on those bits of tape and so on are still there to be seen. So that, I actually went from engineering more into electronics and then very quickly into computing at Marconi Instruments, and then moved to Logica. So I still have my Logica diary. You remember one of these old style, no power needed. I still actually use one of these because I think these are much better for recording your life than smartphones and things, most of which will be lost to posterity. So I've actually got a whole, from this time, this is 1979 through to now, now I do Oxford University diaries. So at least my life is sort of recorded in a reasonably safe medium there. So I was I moved to Logica in London, and at this time my wife was actually working at the Science Museum. So that's where my interest in museums started. And I was getting a bit fed up with real work in industry. as you know, it's much more fun in academia. So I actually found a job at Imperial College, which is right next door to the Science Museum. So that was great for commuting. So I moved there, and I was working on a big Fortran program to do chemical engineering simulation to start with, but then moving into the microprocessor unit. This was when early 80s microprocessors were just coming in. Mostly 8 bits, some 16 bits, but people were using them for their research, and they needed a central place to help them with microprocessors. So there was I knowing a little bit about computing and certainly electronics and so on. My wife was there at the Science Museum, a couple of 100 yards away. She'd done metallurgy at university, but of course they then put her in charge of the computing collection, as they often do in museums. So she, I guess, didn't know that much about computing, but between the two of us, that worked rather well because she was put in charge of doing 2 temporary exhibitions at the time. One of them was called Challenge of the Chip. So here's the original little leaflet on that. And that, let me check the date. That was in 1980. So I helped to do a demo for that, which may well be one of the first demos. There's very little. There's a picture of it. You can see on a PET computer, and it was simulating a field effect transistor, so you can see all the little electrons running around, and that was sitting in the gallery running all day. Interestingly, after that special exhibition, it's all sat there in a corner, and you could see etched into the phosphor on the tube this demo of the field effect transistor. So I don't know where that PET computer's gone now, but on its screen you can still see that even if the electricity doesn't work. So in parallel with that, well, of course, that was all doing things on cassette tapes like this. So I actually worked also they were starting to do museum databases and so on. So I actually wrote a little program for PET to do a small database for the Science Museum, which had, well, in fact, this is one of my first things I wrote. You probably can hardly read this because this is printed on a daisy wheel printer, the index system manual. I've actually put it online so you can see it on ResearchGate. You want unpublished, but so that was a little index system that they reckon was one of the first, well, certainly for them, actually using computers to index things. But it was only a very small thing at the time. So that's obviously I was getting interested in doing these demonstrations, and my wife continued to do exhibitions. They were always having special exhibitions. So after Challenge of the Chip, there was another exhibition called This Is It, IT, it's a play on the IT with an uppercase IT. So I did another demo for that, which was on an HP 85, which I've sort of lost virtually everything for that. But I think well, that was on one of these sort of tapes. So there's a slightly different tape where I can read this. I don't know. At least probably these are real cassette tapes. They're probably readable still, and I can maybe get the program off. I've got to go and find, if I want this one, I've got to go and find somebody with an HP 85, etc. I've got lots of these odd cassettes, like the whole box down here. I'm not going to show you all of them. But sometime I'm going to go to the National Museum of Computing here in the UK, where they do have a lot of these micro computers, and try and save some of these, especially the demos at the Science Museum. So when I manage to do that, I will actually write something about it as a paper, but for the moment this seems more appropriate just talking about it. So I can't, it was some sort of word game, but I can't even remember exactly what that looked like in the mists of time. I guess the next one that I really remember especially was my wife helped set up the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television up in Bradford. And she was working days and nights setting up this museum. And again, they wanted some demonstrations. So they decided they had a wonderful view over Bradford looking at a vista. It was meant to be a theatre, but it became a big white elephant and never opened as a theatre. So it became a museum. And they wanted to have something to go with that view. So well, here's a little thing of the view. So they put up a real thing to actually look at the view upside down, like you might see in an old camera. But then they wanted something more computerized. So this is the more computerized version on a BBC Micro, where it let you look at the view with different telephoto lenses. So it drew that picture that you can vaguely see there, a different telephoto lens lengths very slowly at that time. So this is one of my first goes at doing color graphics. As you can see, that's all in nice color, but I think about 16 colors is all it had. And again, I've got the tape. It's one of these things that's got that on it. So that's certainly one I'd like to resurrect. So those are the main things I actually did at the museum. I guess in parallel, I was interested in graphics. I was writing articles on things like hypercubes, and I went off to Silicon Graphics in California because my best friend from university helped set up that. So I was doing quite a lot of graphics things in parallel. But I really wanted to sort of show these various things that exist at home. But it's a little project of mine to eventually perhaps bring them back to life. I know there's lots of simulators online. I'm sure there's PET simulators and BBC Micro simulators. So my current project, well, not current, but a planned project, is to get some of those tapes onto the internet or onto my computer, and then get them running on simulators and perhaps get them re-going again. So that's a little bit of prehistory about 15 years or so, or 10 to 15 years before I started setting up the virtual library museums pages. There's no real connection apart from the fact that they're both IT. They're both inspired by my wife because she was in museums. So you can thank my wife for the museums, virtual museums pages existing, all these demos existing, and so on. Any questions? You're muted. Yeah.
No. I was just looking up to see if there were some pet computer simulators online, and it looked like it. Yeah.
Yeah, there are. I mean, I've looked, but the main thing is getting it off this, which is basically if you play this even on an audio thing, you can hear the squeaky sounds of it. But I really want to go to the National Museum of Computing to do it properly, because they actually have, a BBC Micro, a PET. They have all these things. They may not have the HP 85, which is slightly rarer beast. But I've got a whole box down here of stuff. I'll see if I can pick it up. Down here somewhere, there's a huge crate of old media, including large 8-track tapes and all these other things. But I think the ones I'd really like to get going are these Science Museum ones, because they'll be quite fun with the graphics and so on.
I have to say I am envious of your box. I have a similar box here, but it doesn't go back anywhere near as far.
Right. Yeah. Well, all the recent stuff is all online, of course. So you'd don't have to collect all this physical stuff. Well, I do. That said, I do have a whole pile of drives, hard drives. They're not in that box. They're actually in the safe, because I guess they're more recent and they're my backups at the moment.
I took a box of 5 1/4 discs not too long ago to try it someplace that still had a working drive, but half of them were, and this is from 1980, right? Unreadable.
Yeah, well, I've got all the the 5 1/4 and 3 and was it 3 3/4. Yeah. So I've got those as well. I suspect a lot of them are gone. I'll take them with me to the National Museum to see if anything's still available. I do have printouts of some of this stuff, some of which has gone to the University of Swansea. But this is another problem with old printouts. If you remember these sort of things which fade in the sunlight, so this you can still just about read some of these programs. So but I think probably I can still read them off these cassettes. I suspect those last reasonably well enough. I'm hoping to actually get them off electronically. So this thing would be a last resort, but I have got some of those. I've got a few slides here if you want to have a look at any.
Sure, you should be able to share your screen with us.
Okay, I'll do a share just a moment. I'll get the so some of it will be running through, and I'm going to skip some of it because it was talking about other things. Let me just check how I share screen. Yes, here we go. Is that sharing? Yes, okay. And if I make that, yes, there we go. So you can see that screen now. Yes, okay. Okay, well that's actually me at the Science Museum actually programming the Babbage difference engine. That's one of the advantages of having a wife who's a museum curator. They can actually open up the case and let you play with these things. Obviously, most people, you can't get into the case, but that thing's still there, and you can go and see it at the Science Museum. I'm going to skip through. So this was I'm going to skip forward to a bit. Yes, so here's all that digital media that I was talking about, starting with my paper tapes, then cards. Although all those floppy disks look the same size, if you look at the ruler, they're going down from 8 inches down. Then at Oxford University, where I was after working at Imperial College, actually that tape, I'm just trying to remember, I think that tape is from Oxford University. Then, as you can see, various different types of cassette, the ordinary audio cassette, but lots of other odd cassettes, some of which is stuff I'd like to get back. Then, of course, there was all the CDs and DVDs and so on. But then also print stuff. So at the top left there, you can see the old fading stuff, the Daisy Wheel printer stuff. The bottom is when I went to Silicon Graphics. So of course in the early 80s, they were close to Xerox PARC. They had a nice early laser printer. So it was all beautiful laser printed stuff, not dissimilar to what we do today. I guess the only difference was it was about the size of a washing machine, the laser printer then, but certainly the quality was not dissimilar. And those were all the hypercubes I was printing out and doing on those SGI machines. Yes, so I was, I was writing articles about hypercubes and so on. I was also just doing popular articles. So this was one for, in fact, through somebody I knew at the Science Museum, doing simple graphics on early microcomputers. So there's a better view of the PET demo, although it makes it look as if she's actually using it. This demo just ran autonomously. You didn't type anything in once it was running, but you can just about see there the field effect transistor sitting there, and there were electrons whizzing around. And that's a better view of the demo of the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television. So you can see that's I think that's, I can't remember which telephoto lens that is, but it went from wide angle up to telephoto, to showing you to different magnifications. So I think that's, yes, that's probably the main things I wanted to show you that I've actually got on slides. And I'll probably be using some of those if and when I actually write something about this. But I can send you this if that helps for your archive.
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd also be curious to know. So what was it like working with the Science Museum while you were at Imperial College London? I mean, what was the, as you say, your wife was curator, so that probably helped, right?
Well, that helped a lot, I think, yes, because as nepotism is always wonderful.
Right.
Basically, there were no problems at all. I just did it. Yes, you didn't have to go out to tender or any of these modern concepts like that.
Well, the reason I asked,
yeah.
So I was going to say, the reason I asked is that, we hear a lot of stories, especially in the early days of computing in museums, where a lot of the museum curators are very reluctant to have a lot of this technology come in. Do you even get the sense of that at the Science Museum then?
Well, I suppose I was dealing with my wife and she wanted this, so no. I'm sure there were probably some people who, but I think being the Science Museum, it'd be less reluctance. I think you got more reluctance at places like the Victoria and Albert over the road and so on, where even now some of them don't really like computers in the galleries. There are some computers in the galleries there now. Yes, in fact, the first museum in the UK that went on the web was the Natural History Museum, which was next to the Science Museum. So they beat the Science Museum in terms of going online. I think the Science Museum did have a computing then and now gallery, which actually had a link to Imperial College, very slow, I think sort of teletype type. I can't remember, about 50, 100 baud or something like that. So in their gallery, you could do something on the Imperial College computer. So I guess they were used to having, it's part of science history, computers. So I think from that point of view, there were enough people there who weren't really against computers per se. So I don't remember any great problem at all. It was all just a lot of fun because it was with my wife, and and you went to the opening, and that was all fun. And she was working incredibly hard day and night because, like most curators, when there's a special exhibition, it's all been delayed, and you have to get things done. So but actually, I think I wasn't part of a delay. Amazingly, for an IT project, they were all done on time, in budget, which is unusual for IT projects. But as you can see, they weren't major projects. It was just me. All these projects probably took less than a week to do each of them. So I guess one other project I haven't mentioned is that one project that made it into the actual permanent galleries was a communications gallery, which was a Morse code demo, which had 4 buttons that let you choose different speeds of Morse code. So that was literally no screen, just a sound. It was on a 6502 board. So I was just creating a ROM to go into the board to run this thing with 4 buttons to do it. So that was probably the most long-lasting, but perhaps slightly less interesting because there's no visuals with it. And that's gone, of course. All these things are gone now because they moved on.
Did they approach you with that idea, or did you approach them?
Well, yes, I think that wasn't my wife's gallery as such, but by that time they knew that I'd done these previous exhibits, and I guess there was this connection with Imperial College because it was next door, and they'd already had something before me in the computing gallery. So probably that helped the fact that I was at Imperial College at the time. And I was cheap, I guess. So compared to going out to, real industry would have charged them an arm and a leg, whereas I was mainly. I mean, they paid me, but I was doing it for the fun of it, really. Sorry, you're still muted, Paul.
I was just nodding and smiling,
Yeah. Okay.
jotting
Yeah.
down notes, right? I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
this is a really interesting time period to be thinking about, right? As museums are coming to grips with how they're going to work computers into the galleries, and so your perspective here, I think, is really fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I'm told that the Science Museum beat the Smithsonian by a year or so in doing this, but by somebody at the Science Museum rather than at the Smithsonian. But perhaps you can talk to somebody at the Smithsonian and what they were doing in the early 80s, late 70s, in terms of computing in the galleries.
Well, actually, very good timing, Jonathan, because we're actually talking in 30 minutes with David Bridge from the Smithsonian.
Oh well, and is he an old hand? Was he there at that time? He was there, was he, in the 70s, 80s?
He was there.
In that case, yes, I'll ask him when the
Yeah.
first exhibits were then, and maybe he'll claim that Smithsonian was first. But I think they were both doing things at a similar time. I guess at that time you had to be a reasonably big museum to be doing that sort of thing. As a small museum, it would have been quite difficult to do anything. And I don't know any small museum was doing anything at that time. Yes, I'll be interested to see the Smithsonian recording, see what happened there. Yeah.
Jonathan, he was more involved with databases and the
Okay.
than exhibits, but he would know probably.
Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, as I mentioned, I did this very small sort of noddy database for a pet, which at the Science Museum, because it was before they were really doing computer databases. So maybe the Smithsonian was faster at doing, proper bigger databases. I don't know, but you can say that. I think I was writing in about 1979. A little mini database on a pet computer for the Science Museum, which I think they used a little bit, but it wasn't. You could only have about 100 objects on it. It wasn't really
That
a
would be
big
very
database.
interesting,
Yeah.
right? So how did they use this? What prompted? Did you come to them? Did they ask you for a database?
I'm just trying to remember now. I mean, I think I may have done it half off my own bat and said, "Look, here, I've written this." I don't remember being paid for that one, because as at Imperial College, basically sitting there, like as you know, in the university, you have a bit of time to do your own thing as well as what you're meant to be doing, and so certainly, I think the first thing I did was that challenge of the chip. I was probably doing it about the same time in parallel with that. And yes, I think I just said, here's this database which you could play with, because I was experimenting myself, what you could do. But there is there is the manual online, just about readable if you go onto ResearchGate. So you could show that to David Bridge or tell him it's there. See what they've got at that time. But it was printed on a daisy wheel printer, so pre any complicated formatting and so on. I think that, and the database was running on because they had a pet that had a disk. I think it was then it was 5¼ inch disk, so it was post the 8-inch disk. But yes, if you had a very expensive pet, you could have a disk on it as well, rather than just the cassette. So I think that's what prompted me to do the database, because now you had a disk where you could actually really do a database. Whereas on a although you can think of this as a Turing machine with a infinite tape on it almost, but it's a bit slow to do databases on a cassette. Whereas once you've got a random access disk, it's a bit quicker.
I'm looking at your ResearchGate page right now. You've got a lot of interesting things uploaded there for sure.
Well, there's a few. Well, I've got lots of different interests as well as museums. So yes. But I think that's the earliest thing I've got online that I wrote is the index system manual. So, because I was a bit of a slow starter academically, in the sense that I thought I was going to be working in industry, and then I sort of drifted back into academia as a research assistant. And while at Imperial College, I didn't really write any papers as such. I wrote a few articles, as you saw, on hypercubes and so on. But only once I got to Oxford did I start really doing academic papers, because I was really in a support role at Imperial College, and I was just interested in the the electronics with all the microprocessors and so on, but then increasingly in the software side. So I've always been interested in the combination of hardware and software, and I guess I sort of know the machine down to the bits level. I'm always amazed people manage to use computers without, it must seem like magic if you don't really know what's going on. But then actually, once you know what's going on, it's even more magic, because why doesn't the whole thing go wrong? Because there's so many layers of complexity to it. Down at the bottom, we're depending on Maxwell's equations, and then up at the top, we're depending on brains trying to think of things, and you're connecting Maxwell's equations with human thought somewhere in the middle with computers and software and so on.
Reminds me of a line I heard recently that computers aren't actually very good at doing math accurately. They're just good at doing math very quickly. So,
yes. Well, I mean, I suppose they're accurate in the sense that, they can do multiplying numbers very quickly. Yes, but they do that fairly accurately.
it was part of a thread about floating point calculation errors.
Oh, right. Okay,
So,
fair enough. In that sense, yes. But then they're probably more accurate than people. I mean, I've just been reading a book by a colleague of mine on Euler, with calculating pi, because the simplistic series for doing pi is only, I think you have to do about 500 iterations before you get pi to about 2 decimal places, something like that. If you use the very simplistic series for pi. So, if you've got a human computer doing that, it's not very efficient. Of course, now they found better series for pi, which you get the answer, or get closer to the answer a lot quicker. But yes, I mean, of course, the term computer is from humans doing computing, not as we now think of as machines doing computing.
yeah. So, Jonathan, I know you've written a lot about the virtual library museum pages, right? And but I'm curious from your personal perspective, when did you first start thinking about museums on the web and seeing what was happening there?
Yeah, well, probably when the web came along. So I had a Sun workstation which had Sunos on it, and of course there wasn't any. You couldn't run any browser on Sunos, whereas you could run the X Windows system on the Sun workstation as well, and then you've got Mosaic, and actually you need enough reason to move from one operating system to another. It has to be an order of magnitude better, and I guess Mosaic convinced me to move from Sunos, where I couldn't browse the web at all, to Mosaic. So I started looking at Mosaic, and at that time, in about 1993 or so, I suppose. Well, I tried it first time, and that time I think there was about 10 megabits per second connection between Europe and the US. So that's slower than most. It's a very slow Ethernet for a whole continent to connect together. So of course I started browsing, and because my wife was in museums, I thought, well, I'll look for some museum things, and I duly did that and found various sort of expo things and so on. But then I noticed any graphics, literally you watch the lines, going like this, and you sat there minutes. So I thought, well, this isn't up to much, is it? But then I did come back to it probably about 6 months later, and I guess they'd probably upgraded the speed of access across the intercontinental access enough that you could actually download things in real time. And also it was very annoying in the UK because at that time we weren't on internet protocols. We were on our own X400 protocols. So everything was a bit different. But we did have a very fast speed connection locally in Oxford University. So I was used to nice fast connections. And we had our own web server. All universities sort of put in a web server. I guess the year before there'd been a Gopher server, which was killed off by the web after about a year or so. But I had access to the web server because I was a research officer there, and you had access to everything. So I noticed a few museums. So literally, I thought, well, I'll just do a little list of museums that have anything on there. So I think at Berkeley there's a paleontology. So I think if you look at my paper in the EVA conference last year with some others as well, it tells you a little bit about some of these early museums online. So I just made a collection of those, and then I noticed also that Tim Berners-Lee with some colleagues had set up this virtual library because this was any real search engines. So if you wanted to find anything, you need some sort of index page to help you find things. So I just emailed off to them and said, look, I'll volunteer to do the museum section, and they said fine. So I just set it up on our web server. And I guess fairly quickly, well, also the nice thing about having your own web server is you've got access to all the logs, all the statistics. Very soon I realized that, the numbers of people accessing the museum's pages far outstripped any interest in any of the research, so on going on the rest of the thing. I mean, it wasn't being overloaded, but I can't remember how many times, but it was several times more access to the museums than everything else on the server. So that just got me interested in moving things along. And I guess going back to the Science Museum, contacts there, John Griffiths, who was one of the curators there, for some reason he decided to have they had an exhibition, I think called the Information Superhighway, which dates it. And then they had a little workshop meeting of about one day where they invited people along. And that was a very good networking place because there was people like Susan and Keane, who was involved with the EVA conference that I'm now involved with on electronic visualization in the arts, but also David Bierman, who I'm sure you know, and maybe you're interviewing him. He'd come over from the US, and everyone else was giving these talks about how wonderful the web was going to be, in the future. Whereas my talk was, this is what I've been doing for the last year or so, and here's all the statistics of access. This is what's going on. So I guess that made a bit of a contrast to what most people were looking at was the future, where they're saying, well, it's already happening. If you like, yes, it's going to be very exciting. I mean, one little statistic, I knew somebody working at the Rupert Murdoch's empire then, and I think I was getting more accesses than they were on their web server at the time. So of course, his little empire is somewhat overtaken me now. If I'd been a bit more savvy, I'd be beating Rupert Murdoch online, but it wasn't to be. Because actually the accesses were going up; they were doubling every 3 months at that time. So I did my little calculation. Oh, it's going to be millions and millions. Of course, it leveled out a few years later, so it didn't keep going off exponentially. But at that time, it really was exponential. But I guess that meant I got invited to the first Museums on the Web conference that David Bierman and Jennifer Trant set up in Los Angeles. And for me, I felt like a royalty because he said, "You're coming along. You're going to, be invited. The honorary chair, give a talk, etc., etc." And they put me up in this. For me, at that time, as an academic, amazing Los Angeles hotel. One of the top suites in it, and so on. But then he said, "Right, yes, as the honorary chair, we want you to say a few words." But he literally only told me that half an hour before. And also, I was used to sort of little meeting. 100 would have been a huge number of people for me. The first Museums on the Web conference had 400 people. So for me, not really having prepared much, he says, stand up and say something. Yes, and at that time I wasn't quite as used to, as I am now, to speaking in front of an audience, so it was a slight nightmare for me. But anyway, I really enjoyed the conference and obviously kept going. Uh, I can't remember how many I went, certainly the first 10 or so, I went to every Museums on the Web conference, so, and I was doing workshops and so on, and gradually developing through contacts, because obviously I wrote papers on the Virtual Library Museums pages, so countries volunteered to join. So Chin in Canada, I think, was one of the first to volunteer to be part of it. ICOM adopted this, which was obviously wonderful. Well, obviously now it's all sort of history because it's disappeared off onto the archive, and it still exists. I think I've got a wiki site where it all sits, but obviously now we've got Google, we've got Wikipedia. So all the museum stuff online as I do now is on Wikipedia, because that's, I think, a very good place to go and find out what museums are where. And I still keep, I still do updates for museums on Wikipedia. If I see a museum that needs a bit of help on Wikipedia, I'm always happy to help with that side of things. So obviously now it's, the Virtual Library Museums pages is history, but I think it was quite an exciting time when it was happening for a decade or so.
Well, and as you say, right, the
Mm.
fact that you're seeing the demand for this almost in real time, right? Will anybody
Yeah.
even want this? And you saw the numbers.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it was. I mean, I didn't sort of predict it, although I suppose looking back, you can see, well, yes, obviously museums are going to be more interested in formal methods, mathematical things. I do remember writing to the, once I'd started doing this, I wrote to the Museums Journal, all very excited. I printed out web pages, because then you had to actually physically write. They didn't have an email address or anything. So I sent them these things saying, this is going to be very exciting for museums. Of course, they didn't write back. I didn't hear anything until about 6 months later. And then they suddenly realized, oh, there is this thing called the web. Oh, somebody wrote to us about that, didn't they? So 6 months later or so, they wrote, and I did do an article for them at that point. But yes, although you can be very enthusiastic, if people don't really know about it, it just lands on the desk, and they don't take much notice. But obviously the web took over, and everybody had to take notice fairly rapidly. But it's interesting to see who wasn't taking notice. I mean, another slight non-museums example of the Royal Society. So I remember saying, they should have a web page. And I remember getting a message back saying, oh, we don't do that sort of thing. Yeah. Of course, now I have written an article on the development of the Royal Society web pages. I don't think I actually put that in the article, but it takes some of these organizations a bit of time to realize that there's something going on. Of course, now they have wonderful web pages and lots of stuff on it.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to write a paper about those early realizations that the web is going to be something.
Yeah.
The one that I personally remember resonated with me was, you remember when the caves of Chauvet were discovered in France in '94?
Oh, yes. Yes. I
And
remember seeing those, yes. Yeah.
that's right. They put some of those pictures on the
That's right.
internet in
Yeah.
December 1994, and they were blown away by the millions of people that clicked on those links. And I remember, it'd probably be impossible to find the interview now, but I remember seeing an interview with the director of this saying, he thought maybe 1 or 2 people would look at it. He had no idea.
No, I know. Yeah, exactly. Now, I was one of the people looking at them. Yes, I remember it well. I mean, another, I guess, not non-museum one, but once at my department, they realised I was the sort of web person. So somebody else who had, well, he was a physicist, so he knew about Tim Berners-Lee, and he was also quite up on European things. So he said, "Well, come to Brussels for the day. They're having a big meeting about the web and what to do." And we thought, well, Tim Berners-Lee might come along to that. So anyway, we went for the date. So it's huge. So they did have a huge meeting. And I remember this Brussels bureaucrat standing up saying, well, yes, there's this web thing that's been invented, but of course, this is just a trial, and this won't be the real thing. We'll be doing the, the real thing. I thought, what a load of rubbish! It's, this is the real thing. Get on with it. Uh, so sadly, Tim Berners-Lee wasn't there. He managed to stood up, because I mean, I guess by that time he'd just been tempted to go off to MIT because obviously he was going to get more money there than in Europe. So, but I think Oxford was sort of at that time trying to tempt him maybe to come to Oxford because he was an Oxford physicist. He was only a year ahead of me as an undergraduate, although I didn't know him there. So I did the same maths lectures as him and so on. But now he's back in Oxford, so he's actually got a post at the computer science department. I mean, obviously not there all the time, but at least he's got a role there, and he turns up every so often.
It's amazing, those near misses, right? You mentioned
Yes.
NCSA Mosaic a little while ago, right? I don't remember if I ever told you I was in class with Mark Andreessen, but we
Oh,
worked
right.
at different research labs at the University of Illinois. So I had
Yes.
nothing to do with NCSA Mosaic, but a friend of mine did, right?
Yes, I know. Yeah, so you might have made your millions, yes. Well, again, because I worked at Silicon Graphics because my best friend at university, tutorial partner, was an American. He went back to Stanford to do a master's, and his supervisor happened to be Jim Clark, who said, "Would you like to found a company with me?" So he was one of the 7 founder members with Jim Clark and his team there. And then he said, "Well, would you like to come out to Silicon Valley?" And I said, "Well, yes, great." And so I went out and worked there for a bit. And it was all very exciting. I was doing all these sort of demonstrations where we could do all these wonderful 3D things, so we could rotate hypercubes in 3D space and so on. I mean, one thing I remember at the end
And
of
of course,
that,
it was
of course,
Jim Clark.
Jim, yeah, that's right. Well, and if, well, he set up $3 billion companies. Okay, they all went up to $1 billion and then down to nothing, but he kept enough of the money to be okay. But he was a serial unicorn setter upper, because then he did Netscape and he did a medical company as well. But I remember at the end of that time, of course, this was pre-digital cameras. So of course, but I had the screen with lots of nice graphics on it. So I thought, well, I want to take some pictures because I was only there for a few months. In fact, that was when I was offered a job to go back to Oxford. So I had to decide, am I going to be a pauper back in Oxford, or am I going to be a millionaire in Silicon Valley? Well, obviously, no choice, is there? I went back to Oxford. But I'm sort of, I mean, that was one of those forks in the road. I'm sort of quite glad I did in some ways. But anyway, so I thought I'd better take a record back of all the things I've done. So of course, no digital cameras. If you wanted to make a record of it, you got your SLR camera, you put it on a tripod in front of the screen, and you put the thing you wanted on the screen, and you took your picture. So I dutifully did all that, and then thought, well, there's all these tubes up in the, and they're creating reflections. So I want to switch them off. So go to the next to the door, look for the light switch. Well, this is very Silicon Valley. There are no light switches. The whole place is on 24 hours a day. People are working there 24 hours a day. Why would you pay for light switches? You just switch the whole place on for the 6 months that you're there or something, and then switch it all off again and move to the next place. So literally, I had to pull the tubes out of the sockets to get it to go dark, and took my pictures and put the tubes back. And but that's a typical Silicon Valley situation. So some of these stories, I am planning to do a memoir to write down some of these silly stories. But that's in. Yes, I haven't really. I've written a little bit, but I've got a lot of silly stories like that that I'd like to write down.
Well, you should. That's a fantastic
Yeah.
Silicon Graphics story, and
Yeah, I plan to. So yeah, but yes, I better do it before. Well, in fact, I think the nice thing about a memoir is all you have to do is write what you remember, not what actually happened. So, of course, there's going to be a disclaimer at the beginning. This is as I remember it. It may be different from what actually happened. I mean, I had but it was, yeah, Silicon Valley is amazing. I'm very glad I did work there for a bit because, my boss was very California laid back. I remember he was invited to do jury service. Uh, and he duly turned up to jury service and then was sent back within the day. And he said, yes, they didn't want me. They said I had a bad attitude. Yeah. he was an incredibly nice guy. But he obviously didn't. You know, I can imagine him with the judge not really taking it very seriously. He was but a wonderful boss. Yes, highly recommended.
Well, I'm wondering if we're reaching a natural wrapping up point here. We got a lot of great stories from you, Jonathan, and
Right.
which really shine a wonderful light of these early days of museum computing. Is there anything else that you wanted to share that you just were thinking of now?
No, I think I've shared most of it. I mean, as you know, most of the virtual library museums pages stuff. So you know, most of the more recent stuff I've actually written. So, for instance, you know, I got very involved with the EVA electronic visualization and the arts conference. So I'm been a co-chair for that for quite a while. Uh, so last year, if you want to look up one of my papers, there's a sort of personal view on the history of that. So I guess a lot of these things I've looked at now, looking back on them in terms of community of practice, you know, the social science way of looking at communities and how they develop. So while I've been involved with these communities, I haven't really, never really thought about them in those terms. But now looking back, I can see how all these communities I've been involved with have developed. So, you know, as a community around the virtual library museums pages, that was a virtual community of about 20 people all working on different parts of the virtual library museums pages. But, you know, that developed, got up to about 20 people who were very much involved. And I guess around that, there were people who were less involved. But then communities naturally die. So that community has sort of died off. But now there's the Wikipedia community, you know, so that's obviously, you know, probably going to last a very long time because you have to get to some critical mass for a community to really last a long time. And Wikipedia is definitely at that critical mass. But you compare that with, you know, there are other wikis where people had tried to have a lot of control. I think Newpedia. So they say, well, if we want quality, we've got to have a lot of control. Any control kills things off. Wikipedia, very little control. There are a lot of laws to do with Wikipedia. Once you get involved, you realize, you know, there's lots of Wikipedia administrators who I like to call Vogons, who are going around forcing you to do things. But it's, you know, you can do things and then it might be removed again, which is a good thing because, you know, if you start to do bad things, then they need to be removed. But by having less control, it lets it, you know, take its own natural course, and that's why Wikipedia's managed to expand so much and become so dominant. So, you know, things like Encyclopedia Britannica, lots of control, dead. So I'm all for freedom in that sense.